So, Kevin, thank you for joining us on G&T this morning.
No, thank you for having me. It's great.
So, by Easter, children will have lost something like 2/3 of an entire year at school. All children, of course, have suffered, some a lot more than others because there's been a huge array of different types of online provision. Is therefore perhaps your first task just to try and work out the true scale of the actual problem here?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So we know that all children have had what you might call a massive shock to their education and their learning. And we've got some estimates and some numbers at the global level, if you like, of what this means. But I think you're right. I think when they get back to school and as soon as that can happen, when it's safe and it's right for them to go back, the first thing schools will do is they will look at their children closely, they'll talk to them, they know them, they'll assess them in the education jargon, and they'll work out exactly what the needs are and where the gaps are. This has got to be school informed for sure.
So could you see when kids come back, whether it's March the 8th or onwards, probably a lot later for all of them, some sort of nationwide diagnostic test just to work out where the basic standards are?
So I think all schools will do that. I think it's a fundamental feature of great teaching. You have to assess, you have to teach, and then you have to see if they've learned the things you taught them. It's the classic cycle of teaching. I'm sure that all schools do that. But by the way, I think it's really important to note that I don't think schools are waiting. There's so much great learning going on online. It's not consistent for everybody, but the innovation and commitment we've seen from schools has been terrific. So I think schools are really building these pictures, and they have been throughout the lockdown. But of course, when they get back, because it's not just the academic stuff that's easy to measure, you've got to be with the kids and be with the young people to see where the social and the emotional learning needs are that you're going to have to address. And you can't do that online so easily. So I think it's a broad array of the whole child that schools are going to look at as they begin to determine what do we need to prioritize now going forward.
Well, I was going to ask about that. I mean, in terms of the scale of the damage that's been done here to children, obviously there's the educational huge setbacks, but also kids haven't been together since mid-December now. That's 2 months and counting. Why is it so important that they are together at that age? And what is the damage that will be done to them, perhaps psychologically, if they haven't been?
Well, I think what we've realized in this lockdown for all of us that know children and around children is that school is not just about, and it is vital, of course, it's not just about the accumulation of knowledge. It's critical, but actually it's about much more than that. It's about the social experience that children have away from the home when they learn to be, if you like, the citizens we want them to be and the human beings we want them to be. So the play, the engagement, the building the friendships, the falling out, the remaking the friendships, all these things are critical, as well as the expressive arts, the competitive sport, the whole thing that goes into a rounded education. The other day we've had a lot of snow where I live, like everyone has, and I was watching some young people sledging, and they were from a family. I wasn't checking or anything, but they were from a family because I know them, and it was just the sound of children really playing and engaging with themselves, which is quite different, and I've missed that, and I think that they've missed that. So you're right, it's a broader set of experiences that children have missed. They've missed the learning, but they've missed much more than that.
So have you had a chance yet to sort of even begin to equate the psychological setbacks? What will the repercussions be on children who've pretty much been isolated for 2 months?
So I think we need to couch our sort of judgment about how much they've lost and they've missed with a real appreciation for the resilience children have. Children are amazingly resilient at bouncing back from things, but I don't want to say that in a way that means there's nothing to deal with. And I really want to think about the fact that you have to know children well to be able to make a judgment about these things. And this is why the relationships in schools are so important between children and their teachers and others they work with. So I want to suggest that we hold fire on making any calls on that until schools have had the chance to be with their children and meet them and talk to us about the needs. I don't think this should come from the top down. I think this should be schools who know their children informing us about exactly what's happened and how the shock has played out.
Okay, the Prime Minister who appointed you a couple of weeks ago, he said that repairing the damage done to children during the pandemic is going to be his government's single biggest priority in the recovery. Have you had a conversation with him personally when you were appointed? And Do you think he's right to make that the government's single biggest priority?
I have had the fortune to have a conversation with the Prime Minister about this, and he made that point to me. Of course, my background, my whole life is education. I would argue it's the most important thing we do. Nothing matters more than education. So I agree with him. Other people might have other views, but unless we get this right, the price is huge, not just for the young people, but for all of us. It really matters, doesn't it? In every way you think about life, that our young people have the skills they need, but also they have the attitudes and relationships and the confidence to participate and be part of our future and who we are. So I completely agree with him.
And what is the timeline you're working to? Obviously, time is slightly of the essence in this because of the huge deficit that's been built up. When can we expect to see your plan or see ministers receive your plan and actual policy being developed on this?
So policy is being developed. It has been. It's not that nobody's, there's a lot of work that's been going on. There's some incredible thinking happening, both the Department for Education and across government. And more importantly, in schools themselves, they're already working on this recovery. So I don't think it's my job necessarily to sort of set out the plan. It's my job to give advice, to give support and challenge in order to make sure that the work that's going on locally and nationally is informed by the evidence, is directed at where we'll get the best promise, but also is implemented effectively. So it's not waiting for a plan. We're doing the work. But your point about the long and the short term is the really important point, Tom. There are some children who will be going back to school into their first year of school. Now, they've missed something very, very important in that early years of reception or whatever, but they've got quite a long time for schools to reorientate, if you like, their curriculum and their provision to help those children. There are some children going back and they've only got a short amount of time left before they move on. So I think we've got to be really urgent about the young people who are at the transitions, young people leaving primary school, going into year 7. We need to make sure that, for example, their literacy skills are where they need to be if we can help them so they can thrive at secondary school, because that really matters. Young people going on to university, how well are the universities going to help them prepare for the course? They might have missed some of the physics A-level content. That's necessary that we cover that before they start their undergraduate course. So it's the transition points where we need to be urgent, but we need to plan over the long term, I think, for all children.
Okay, accept it is not necessarily your plan and it's the government's policies to enact, but when would you like to see actual policy, actual announcements, with time being of the essence, especially those groups you just mentioned?
I think we need to say some things soon, and I mean in the next sort of month or so, about how we're going to support children through this summer. All being well, we're back at school, but after Easter, but that's in the hands of others. But we need to say something very quickly about how we're going to support children through the summer and through the summer holidays. We need to be, I think, then thoughtful about how we plan for the long term. It would be a mistake to sort of knee-jerk this and try and think there's a couple of quick fixes. The most important thing, of course, we do for all children, the best catch-up you give them is to give them a great teacher. Get them back in their classes with a great teacher is for sure the best catch-up we can give them. And how do we support teachers and build the quality of teaching? We've got great teachers, but continue to invest in our teachers, which of course everybody knows is the most important resource in education.
So for a long time, you chaired the Education Endowment Foundation, of course, an independent charity established to improve the attainment of the poorest kids in English schools. What has all your experience with that taught you about what the best way to do catch-up is?
The evidence from the Endowment Foundation is comprehensive. It's a review of everything we've learned through research over the last 20 years across the world in education, and all roads point to the quality of teaching. Quality trumps quantity. How do you get great teaching for all of our children in all of our schools? Because I've always said, and it's pretty well reported, that England has some great schools. We have a good education system. It's not broken, but it's not good enough for everybody. We've got too much variation. We're not good enough yet at supporting particularly our most disadvantaged children. And that's the great challenge, I think, of our education system, to excellence and equity for all of our children. So I think the evidence is clear. Great teaching for all children. The second wave of teaching, you might call it, is really good catch up. You can do it. Small group tuition, the national tutoring program is a great start in my regard for that. But then the wider experiences children need to have. I've always denied the idea there's some kind of battle between enrichment experiences, you might call them, and the hard learning of the academic skills. These two things sit together, and the evidence points to that. They sit in a reciprocal relationship. The broad curriculum, the traditional broad curriculum of the English school, is the very best way forward. And building on the quality of that, rather than thinking we've got to kind of revolutionize this, we've got to evolve and keep growing, and becoming a better system is our best way of improving delivering catch up.
Okay, I mean, I completely accept your point that quality is important, but at the end of the day, it is also going to come down to a certain amount of extra quantity, isn't it? I mean, these aren't necessarily your solutions, but propositions already on the table include, shorter holidays, summer school is beginning, but also more time in the day in the classroom. There surely is no other way to do this completely without increasing the amount of time that kids will spend at school.
It's I'm completely open to everything being on the table, and extending the learning time for children, I think, does need consideration and does need examination. We've got to be careful, though. If you just increase the time without increasing the quality, that the evidence is clear that doesn't deliver. You've got to increase the quality as well as the time. And it's the time to learn. So it might be, for example, not just that you're doing more maths and more English, but actually that you're doing more competitive sport, or you're doing more enrichment experiences. You're involved in drama and art and music, for example. It's the wraparound. We've learned, for example, a great study we did a couple of years ago. If we gave breakfast for children, we gave free breakfast for children in the very beginning of school, all children benefited and made improvement of more than 2 months in the school year in their attainment. So yes, I'm up for it. I'm up for expanding the learning time and supporting teachers to be able to do that. And that might in the day and across the term. I think that all needs to be on the table and considered.
Okay, one of the elements that, of course, has been the most unfair about closing down schools, though it's been a necessity, is, of course, the huge gulf in the difference of quality provision online, especially between private and state schools, the more advantaged and the more disadvantaged. So, for example, there is supposed to be a 7-month gap already between a disadvantaged 7-year-olds and advantaged 7-year-olds, simply over the better quality provision they've had, which is a horrendous statistic, really. Do you think that's right? Do you think that perhaps closing the educational gap, which governments have worked very hard over the last 10 years, 10 whole years perhaps of work has been undone on that, and that gap is now as wide as it's ever been?
I think it's undoubtedly true. And the reason that I've come back into this work is the biggest shock and the biggest loss is going to be for the children who actually need us most. So there's that is a great fear and worry I have. And what we've seen, of course, is parents mobilize and engage in their children's learning in unbelievably inspirational ways. But that's all down to the wherewithal and the capacity you have. The digital divide, that phrase, who has access to technology and to connectivity, really, really matters. I think we've seen a breakthrough in the way technology can support learning. That must now become accessible for all. Otherwise, that becomes another point of divide. You're right. So unfortunately, we haven't seen the access for all children distributed equally, and we do need to make sure in the future that when we ever face something like this again, and I hope we don't, but we have to prepare for it, that all children have access to online learning, all children have the resources they need, because we can't have it that it's you add to the divide when this sort of thing happens. We actually need to support those who need us most if we can. And
another idea that's been kicking around, in fact, it's got the support of people like Lord Baker, former Education Secretary, Sir Peter Lampall runs the Sutton Trust. GCSEs might have been something whose time has passed, especially now. The idea of getting all 16-year-olds to sit exams when there have been so much difference in education amongst those 16-year-olds that we've just been discussing. They're doing A-levels anyway. Do you think GCSEs should be looked at now, perhaps reforming them, not doing them, moving to a baccalaureate as one of the solutions for catch-up, so that outcomes can be equal rather than just what numbers might say on an exam piece of paper?
Yeah, I think it's again a really pertinent question. I mean, I think the trouble is with the shock we faced, we have to be careful about the bandwidth and what do we address, what do we focus on. I've spoken about GCSEs in the past. I think there is a question, there is a discussion about that particular exam at that point. But is this the right time to start a big structural upheaval? I think we need to move as quickly as we can, support those children with the greatest need now as we go back this year. And then I think there's a broader, much bigger conversation to have over the next 6 months or year or so about the kind of what COVID has taught us and how we want to think about the education system. But I don't think it's for now to call that out. But again, I think this is a good time to have these sort of conversations in the next year or so.
Well, it is indeed, because radical action is really rather necessary, some might argue. So it sounds like you would be in favour of reforming or scrapping GCSEs.
I'm in favour of always considering how do we best support children to transition to work and to further learning at the end of secondary school. I think the GCSE exam in itself is a perfectly valid way of assessing children. It's the fairest way we know. Exams are the best way to create the assessment for all children. And I don't think it's the right time now to open up the debate about that. It just seems to me to be a slight diversion when we really want to work on what's in front of us, and that is the needs of our children as they return after this long break from their education.
Okay, final quick couple of questions for you. We should talk about resources, because so far the government has committed 300 million on teaching programs and £1 billion for the COVID catch-up fund. Now, the Institute for Fiscal Studies came up with some pretty terrifying sums a few weeks ago. They calculated that the normal cost of half a year only of schooling to the government is around 30 billion. Do you agree that that is the sort of figure that the government will need to put back into the system to make catch-up a success?
So I saw obviously I know the IFS materials, and you're right, the government so far have committed 1.3 billion. I've said I think that's a good start, but I'm clear that isn't going to do the job. The question of how much additional funding you put in, I do think it will require additional funding, by the way, although I haven't got a number for that, and how that aligns to and relates to the money we spend every day on education, I think is the bit. It's not just bolting a bit more on. It's about reorientating what we currently do. So a good example would be, if you're currently teaching year 7, children of the first year of secondary schools, we're going to have to support teachers in that year group to be ready to perhaps to receive more children who need help with their literacy. Now, you do that by improving the quality of the teaching and making sure the expertise is there, not necessarily just by bolting a bit on. But will it pay off to the country in the long run if we improve our education system? I think the economic argument is very strong. Of course, skills are the most important thing, and how do we build those skills? Our education system can do it, and we will have to recover from this, and we will have to invest in it. But we're investing in the future, as well as investing our children in the here and now.
I mean, admittedly, you can't put a number on it now, but we are talking about the tens of billions, aren't we, over the long term?
I wouldn't even go into that ballpark. We are talking about a lot of money, in my view, yes.
Okay, final question for you, Sir Kevan. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope this is not too bleak, but what do you think about the huge array of different provision over the last year, the huge gaps of classroom time that kids have had, and how far behind the most disadvantaged have got? Is it ever going to be possible to repair all the damage done to this generation of school pupils? And if it is possible, how long would it take?
I do trust our children, and I trust our schools. I think we will recover from this. I think the resilience of young people in the system we have will come through, but it will need support, and we will need to stay with it. I worry that the initial interest, the initial investment, the initial activity isn't sustained over the long period. That the children, we're going to need support teachers and children for the long term to recover this, but we can. How long will it take? I think you could probably say that as you look at a child in reception going into school next September, will we need to support that child through the primary school in terms of recovering all of this? Probably 4 or 5 years. I think we should be thinking about that sort of time frame in the end, that this will impact on the way we provide education for our children. This will be something we have to think about as we reorientate and rethink about the provision we make.
So it's a 5-year job.
I think so. We're in that, I wouldn't like to call it, but I think, yeah, we're in that sort of territory.
Okay, so Kevan Collins, thank you so much for talking to G&T this morning, for your time.
Thanks, Tom. Good to see you.
Great. Kevin, that was really good. Thank you so much. You definitely feel this one. I'm reassured we've got the right guy for the job.
I don't know. It's navigating what I know with what I don't know, Tom.
I know. Well, it just struck me thinking about it this morning, is that, you know, how can you even map out the problem? And I get it's got to be for schools to do that, but God, it's a what a task. Well,
it's going to be so varied. The range is going to be
that's
the stunning bit. That there'll be some kids that have had such wonderful provision at home, you know, you might not notice much. There's going to be others that have had very, very little. And that's going to be the range is the great worry.
And then there'll be obviously the huge fight over resources, as one school says, well, look, our kids need more than, it's a long one. Well, look, the very best of luck to you. And if we can ever help, then hopefully you know where I am, where you can find me. And please shout.
Thanks very much.